The Pool Guy Podcast Show. The Pool Guy Podcast Show. The Pool Guy Podcast Show. Yeah!
Hi, and welcome to the Pool Guy Podcast Show. In this episode, I'm going to go over some of the myths and misconceptions of Trichlor tablets, and I'm going to try to educate you on a lot of aspects of it that you may not hear at the local pool store or from doing any kind of searches online. I'm going to try to cover every detail here so that you get a good grasp of what Trichlor does in the pool and why you may want to limit your usage of Trichlor tablets, not just because of the price point now, but because of all the side effects or byproducts that it may produce in your pool. Pool Service Pro, open a Leslie's wholesale account today and receive wholesale pricing on products you use every day. Leslie's Pool Supply offers convenient locations that are open 7 days a week. Another great benefit of opening a Leslie's wholesale account is Leslie's referral program. Get referred to a customer looking for weekly pool service. Also receive priority service, enhanced rebate programs, a discount on your general liability insurance through SPA, a discount on your pool routing software through Skimmer, and an opportunity to co-brand with Leslie's on your social media, website, truck, and more. Save time and money and grow your pool service route and become a Leslie's Pro. And I would say Trichlor is not a bad product. It's kind of like, when you have eggs in the morning, there's some good aspects of it, but if you eat 3 eggs every day, it's probably not good for you, and the cholesterol level in your body is going to skyrocket. And the same thing for running or jogging. You can overdo it if you're jogging on the wrong surface or jogging with the wrong shoes or jogging too long. So anything good can be bad in some respects if you're not doing it right. And I think with the Trichlor tablets, a lot of the problems you're having with your pool is because you're not using the Trichlor properly. It was never intended, again, let me say that, it was never intended really to be the primary sanitizer in the pool, nor was it intended to be the way to maintain a pool's chlorine level. And you're going to see some of the reasons here why that wasn't intended, but it just became that way because it's really easy to use the Trichlor tablets out on your pool route, or as a homeowner, it's a really easy way to use them. I remember when the shortage was happening or just starting, there was a newscaster that held one in his hand and said, "These things are magic," and people think they are, and they are kind of like a magic bullet to the pool, or magic pill or tablet, I should say. But there are some things you need to be aware of. And so let me go over the number one drawback of Trichlor for you here. And that is about half of the Trichlor tablet itself is cyanuric acid, maybe more than half in some cases. So you can't have a Trichlor tablet without having cyanuric acid in it. It's the actual makeup of the Trichlor tablet. That is the chemical makeup of what Trichlor is. So half of that, and I'm just being really basic here, half of that is cyanuric acid. So what's so wrong about adding a large amount of cyanuric acid to your pool? Most agree that 50 parts per million should be the maximum in a chlorine pool, 80 parts per million in a saltwater generator, which you wouldn't need to worry about using tablets in most cases. But for a regular chlorine type pool, you want to have the cyanuric acid at 50 parts per million. And in the early days, there was a lot of talk about chlorine lock and chlorine being ineffective when the cyanuric acid got to a high level. We now know that that's probably not the complete truth behind it. What happens is that more of the chlorine is kind of bound in cyanuric acid, which makes it work less effectively in the pool. And so basically the speed at which it kills bacteria, viruses, and algae is hindered by a larger amount of the cyanuric acid in the water itself. And I'm going to refer to Bob Lowry's calculations here so you get an idea of what I'm talking about and why having such a large amount of cyanuric acid is bad and hard to manage when you have a pool with a very high level. So let me just use a 15,000 gallon pool as an example. Let's say that you have a 15,000 gallon pool, which is relatively small, or relatively medium, I should say. It's not small or large. It's pretty average out there in my area and most areas of the country. So you have a 15,000 gallon pool and you're going to use a 50-pound bucket of Trichlor tablets. And let's say you add all 50 pounds to your pool in one season. That'd be like 3 or 4 tablets a week, which is not uncommon, and it's something that can be done with little effort in a lot of cases. So the math is going to be really simple here. So you should be able to track this. You have a 15,000 gallon pool. you're going to use a whole 50-pound bucket of Trichlor in that pool. And if I mentioned that half of the 50-pound bucket is cyanuric acid, then you're going to be adding 25 pounds of cyanuric acid to that pool during the season, which will bring it to 200 parts per million of cyanuric acid. And remember, 50 parts per million is the acceptable range of cyanuric acid in your pool. By most experts, they all agree that's like the highest you should have it. So 15,000 gallon pool, 50 pounds of Trichlor tablets, you're adding 25 pounds of cyanuric acid, bringing that level to 200 parts per million. And here's where it gets kind of tricky, because not only are you using more chlorine, as you're going to find out in a minute, but by adding more tablets, you're going to have to keep adding more tablets to keep that chlorine level going up. And so the problem is kind of like a runaway car, or if you're on a hill and your car has no brakes, you're going down and going faster and faster. The same kind of effect happens when you start using tablets as your primary sanitizer, overuse them, and then you kind of slide down that hill in no way of stopping, and then your pool cyanuric acid level gets to 200 parts per million, which is really high. I think, as everyone probably agrees, that Bob Lowry was the premier expert on pool chemistry, and he came up with this formula that your free chlorine level should be 7.5% of your cyanuric acid level, regardless of the pH of the pool or other factors in the pool. This is just your free chlorine level versus or based on how much cyanuric acid is in the pool. And it's 7.5% of your free chlorine to cyanuric acid. And so in a case where you have a pool with 50 parts per million of cyanuric acid, if you times that by 7.5%, in a pool with a cyanuric acid level of 50 parts per million, you're going to need 3.75 parts per million of free chlorine. Let's just say 4 parts per million. And that's definitely doable. 4 parts per million is not a huge amount of chlorine in the pool. And then if you take that same math now, and you have this pool here where it's at 200 parts per million, you're going to need 15 parts per million of free chlorine to prevent algae in that pool, or prevent that pool from turning on you, and to kill viruses and bacteria effectively. 15 parts per million versus 4 parts per million at the right level. So you can see how having the high cyanuric acid will cause you to keep a higher free chlorine level. And this is why you can have a pool that has a chlorine reading of 10 parts per million and still have algae in the pool. And you may be thinking, wow, this algae is chlorine resistant. Not necessarily chlorine resistant. It's just because the chlorine is not effective at 10 parts per million. You're probably going to need 5 more parts per million to make it effective. And the reason why you have algae in a pool with 10 parts per million is not because it has a problem with the filter or it has a problem with anything else. It's just that there's not enough free chlorine in that pool because the cyanuric acid level is too high in that pool. And that's why a lot of homeowners have trouble during the season. In the middle of the season, they start to get algae blooms and can't control it. And they think, oh, my pool was overused by the kids or something's going on here. It's just that at the beginning of the season, your cyanuric acid level may have been around 70 or 80. And by mid-season, you're at 150. And then the chlorine you were putting in to maintain it is not going to be enough to maintain it 2 months down the road or 2 weeks down the road for that fact. And so that's why the high cyanuric acid level is really bad for pool maintenance and why a lot of people struggle maintaining their pool if they use Trichlor tablets as their primary sanitizer in their pool. Here's a couple other things to note about the Trichlor tablet. And this is that, well, the water's going to evaporate and then I'm going to add fresh water to the pool and therefore the cyanuric acid level is not going to rise. That's a big misconception because yes, the water will evaporate. However, only the pure water evaporates, and so the cyanuric acid does not come out of the water when it evaporates. It stays in there. And in fact, the only way to remove the cyanuric acid from the pool is by draining partially or completely. So this pool that has a cyanuric acid level of 200 parts per million, you can drain that pool halfway down at the end of the season and get it to 100 parts per million. You can drain it down 3/4 and get it down to 50 parts per million. But the only way to eliminate the cyanuric acid in the water is by draining it. Refilling it, topping the pool off, does not do anything because, yes, water will evaporate. And here in my area, I think about 18 inches a summer evaporates out of the pool. But none of that 18 inches contains any cyanuric acid. And the only way to remove it is by draining your pool, which in some cases is not really recommended because of right now we're in a drought condition. And so by doing that, you're probably going to get a higher water bill. And this goes to my next point, and that is that the Trichlor tablets is the most inexpensive way to maintain a pool. It may have been at some point. Now it's not because of the price of the Trichlor tablets, but maybe back when it was $100 a bucket for 50 pounds, you could have maintained your pool relatively inexpensively, even if you had to drain, half the pool or partially drain the pool. It wouldn't be that bad. But now that you're paying $200 or $250 for that same bucket, I should say, then it's not cost prohibitive to use the Trichlor tablets and then drain the pool at the end of the season also, or partially drain the pool. For that reason, I don't think it's the less expensive way to maintain the pool any longer. And it could be very expensive because you're going to be putting in a lot of shock, liquid chlorine. You're going to be putting algicides in there to try to keep that water balanced because of the fact that, again, a pool with a higher cyanuric acid level needs more free chlorine to make it effective. Again, use that 7.5% number. So if you had a pool with 100 parts per million of cyanuric acid, you would need to keep that chlorine at 7.5 parts per million. And that's not just that day or that week. That's every day that the pool is open and running and operating. If that chlorine level drops from 7.5, let's keep that example that I just said, down to 5 parts per million, chances are 3 days down the road, you're going to get algae in the pool, and it's going to bloom in that pool, even with a chlorine level of 5 parts per million, because the cyanuric acid level is at 100 parts per million. And so the cyanuric acid in the Trichlor does not evaporate when the pool water evaporates. You can only drain it or partially drain it. It may come out with splash out from everyone swimming in the pool, or by backwashing it if you have a sand filter or D-filter. Other than that, it does not get removed from the water except through draining. If you follow Rudy Stankiewicz in any of his material, you can remove cyanuric acid with pool flock, and this is putting in a certain amount of flock to the pool, aluminum sulfate, and this does seem to remove some of the cyanuric acid from the pool effectively. But for most homeowners and pool pros, draining the pool is probably a little bit easier. If you don't have a portable vacuum to vacuum all that out, or if you don't have a vacuum to waste, it makes it a little more difficult to use that flock method. But I'll give Rudy credit for discovering this as one way to remove cyanuric acid from the pool besides draining the pool. Another big misconception is that 3-inch Trichlor tablets are the easiest way to maintain a pool. It may appear so on the surface because all you gotta do is put the tablet in the floater or in the inline chlorinator, and then you don't have to really worry about too much because, again, it has that cyanuric acid as a stabilizer, and so that's going to keep the chlorine in the pool protected from the UV rays. And I should mention, I guess, that the cyanuric acid does have a purpose in the pool, and that is it shields the chlorine from the sun's UV rays and makes it last a lot longer in the pool. And that's why cyanuric acid is used in the pool, the 50 parts per million. I probably should have mentioned that earlier, but most people would be up to that already and know that aspect of it. And if you don't know it, then there it is for you right there. But back to the point that people think that Trichlor tablets are the easiest way to maintain a pool. And there's really a lot of factors involved in the Trichlor tablet that make it really hard to use it as a proper way to sanitize the pool. And here are some factors that affect the Trichlor, or the amount of chlorine that's being introduced into the pool water through the Trichlor tablets dissolving in the pool. One factor is runtime. How long do you run your pool? This will determine how much Trichlor is dispersed. And then with that runtime, where is that tablet sitting? Is it in an inline chlorinator, like a Rainbow 300, or is it in a floater in the pool? And that's another factor. If it's in the chlorinator, of course, the tablets are going to dissolve a lot faster than if they're in the floater. Then the water temperature is a huge factor. The colder the water, the less the tablet will dissolve in the pool, and the less chlorine you're going to need in that cold water. And that's another whole story right there. But basically, the water temperature is a factor in the amount of Trichlor, or in the amount of chlorine that gets into the pool. Then the size of the pool. If you have a 40,000 gallon pool, of course, you're going to need to put more Trichlor tablets in the floater or inline chlorinator than a 20,000 gallon pool. Then you have the amount of tablets you're going to use when you fill it up each week. If you put 5 tablets in the floater, you're going to have a higher chlorine level than if you put 2 tablets in there. Same with the inline chlorinator. If you put 10 tablets in there, you're going to have a higher chlorine level than if you were to put 5 tablets in there. And then the pool use is another factor. If the pool is being heavily used, the chlorine is going to be used up more, and it's going to be harder to gauge how much chlorine is actually needed in that pool. So you can see that Trichlor tablets are actually a pretty complicated way of introducing the chlorine to the pool. And then the brand of tablets is also a factor. Some are bigger than others. Some are 6 ounces, some are 8 ounces. And you won't know, if you put 3 of one tablet in, you're having less ounces than the other. So this all makes it much more complicated to balance the pool with Trichlor. And that's why when you start using Trichlor tablets, you may have a chlorine level of like 20 parts per million the first week because you're like, whoa, I put 4 tablets in there. I had no idea I was going to raise the chlorine this high. Or you may put a tablet in or 2 tablets in and have 0 chlorine in there because you didn't put enough Trichlor tablets in. Maybe you didn't run the pool long enough. Maybe the pool water is much warmer or there's heavy usage. So these are all factors that make it really hard to determine how much chlorine is being introduced into the water by the Trichlor tablets themselves dissolving. I was contacted by a manufacturer in China that was making an inline chlorinator, and they wanted me to come up with a calculation for them of how many tablets to put in there and how much chlorine is going to produce. And I gave them these factors, and they're like, so there's no way to know? I'm like, there's really no way to know because of all these factors. So they couldn't put anything on their labeling of putting how many tablets in increases the level by X amount. And it's one of those things where it looks easy because you're putting the tablets in there and the chlorine level is going up. But if you ever tried to regulate it to keep a pool at 3 parts per million, week after week with Trichlor tablets, you're going to find that it's very difficult. And then that 3 parts per million, again, is way too low in most cases. For a pool using Trichlor, you may have to keep the level of free chlorine at 8 parts per million, 10 parts per million, 15 parts per million. And just note that the Los Angeles County Health Department, which is in my area, recommends no more than 10 parts per million of free chlorine, and they'll close down a commercial pool if it has more than 10 parts per million of free chlorine. So if you have a residential pool with a cyanuric acid level of 200 parts per million, and you're keeping it at 15 parts per million free chlorine, note that if the LA County Health Department came to your backyard, they would shut your pool down. They won't do that because health departments don't inspect residential pools, but that means that your pool and your free chlorine level is not acceptable to the county health department, which is kind of scary in a way. And this is kind of one of the side effects of having or using the Trichlor tablets as your primary sanitizer. And let me touch on a few more things, and then I'll move on to some solutions that you can introduce to reduce the amount of Trichlor tablets you're using in your pool. Another aspect of the Trichlor tablet is that they're low in pH. They're like 2 or 3 in pH, and this causes a number of issues. If you put the Trichlor tablets in your skimmer basket, this is a problem because the low pH is going to damage your heater, maybe some filter parts or anything metal in the pool. Your pool's check valves and so forth can be damaged by the low pH, so that's one problem there. If a tablet were to fall out of a floater, it's going to stain the bottom of the pool because, again, it has a really low pH, so it'll burn the surface of the pool. And even if you have a floater on the first step of the pool, you're going to see a burn from the Trichlor inside the floater by having it rest on that first step or get near that first step of the pool. So if you have a fiberglass or vinyl pool, it's definitely not advisable for you to use Trichlor tablets in there because the acid demand in a fiberglass and vinyl pool is low to begin with. Plus, if the tablet were to fall out, it could stain the surface. And a lot of fiberglass manufacturers are going to void the warranty if you use Trichlor tablets in there. So just be aware of that. If you have those surface types, Trichlor is definitely something you don't want to use in that. And then they can be very toxic. If the bucket were to get wet, if you leave the lid open and water gets in there, since they have acid in there and chlorine together, it makes a mustard gas of sorts. And if you take that lid off and there's water in there, that plume of acid chlorine could knock you out, literally and physically. So just be aware that they can be highly toxic if not stored correctly. And this is another drawback of the Trichlor tablets. Compared to liquid chlorine or cal hypo, the toxicity of the Trichlor tablet is a lot higher than the other forms of chlorine. So here are some effective ways to reduce the amount of Trichlor you're going to use in your pool, and that's by using an enhancer. I would suggest one of 3 of these enhancers. You can use a combination of any of these. You can use phosphate and enzyme treatments. This is a great way to reduce the amount of chlorine you're going to be putting into your pool, and this is really effective. One season on my route, I just used phosphate and enzymes, and it worked effectively. and allowing me to use less chlorine in the pool. You can use something like the Pool RX, which is a mineral system that's going to lower your usage of chlorine by at least 30%. Or you can add borates to the pool water to 50 parts per million, and this will also reduce the amount of chlorine you're going to use. Note that Bob Lowry, he has a formula that I mentioned earlier, that 7.5% of free chlorine should be equal to the cyanuric acid level. But if you have borates in the pool to 50 parts per million, that number will drop to 5%. So if you had 100 parts per million of cyanuric acid, you would just need 5 parts per million of free chlorine versus 7.5 parts per million. Put the borates in the pool. So it's an effective way to lower the amount of chlorine you're going to use in the pool. And it also changes the math on the chlorine to cyanuric acid level to 5% from 7.5%. So the enhancers are a great way to go from using 3 tablets to 1 tablet. And then if you're going to need to raise the chlorine level in the pool, I would suggest using liquid chlorine or Cal-Hypo shock, or Cal-Hypo granular, I should say. And this is a way to add chlorine to your pool in a safer way, so to say. There's some byproducts to Cal-Hypo. It'll add calcium to the water. And then with liquid chlorine, it'll add salt to the water. But I would take calcium and salt any day over cyanuric acid. And so you can maintain a pool fairly effectively by using one of these enhancers that I mentioned, the phosphated enzymes, the borate, or the Pool RX. And then you can, of course, go with liquid chlorine or the Cal-Hypo bags of granular Cal-Hypo. And this is an effective way to add chlorine to the pool with less byproducts going in there, or less harmful byproducts going into the pool. And then the end game would be, of course, to get a saltwater generator and just have that produce the chlorine for you. And then you won't need tablets at all, basically, in that case. You won't need any liquid chlorine or Cal-Hypo in most cases either, because the saltwater generator will make the chlorine for you. And there's not many byproducts there, except that you have a lot of salt in the water because that's how it makes the chlorine. But other than that, that would be the end game, I think, if you wanted to get away from Trichlor altogether. But you can definitely limit your use of Trichlor by using it as a secondary sanitizer and using liquid chlorine and Cal-Hypo as your primary sanitizer in your pool. Basically, you're going to lose about 1 part per million of free chlorine a day if you have your cyanuric acid at 50 parts per million. So if you start the week with your chlorine level at 5 parts per million, and let's say you start Monday, you test the waters at 5 parts per million, then by the middle of the week or near the end of the week, you're going to have to add some more liquid chlorine to bring it back up. And you can surely operate a pool or maintain a pool with just liquid chlorine if you have a liquid chlorine feeder. HASA has one that you can purchase, or if you just add 1 gallon at the beginning of the week and then 1 gallon middle of the week. At the middle of the week, you can maintain the pool without any tablets at all, period. Or if you had a Trichlor tablet in a floater and you started the week at 5 parts per million, with that tablet in there, it may maintain the chlorine level a little bit better for you. And if you just use 10 or 15 tablets during the season, you're not going to raise your cyanuric acid level up dramatically. And I think that's the way to go. Using the Trichlor as a secondary sanitizer is much better for the pool than using it as a primary sanitizer. And once you get all the pools on your pool route over to this method, you have an enhancer in there, and then you have the Trichlor as a secondary sanitizer, using liquid chlorine or Cal-Hypo as your primary sanitizer. You can maintain your pools a lot easier because then the cyanuric acid is not going to be at 100 or 200 parts per million in the middle of the season, which makes it really hard for you to maintain that pool without adding more tablets to it, which of course exacerbates the problem and causes more cyanuric acid to be introduced to the pool water, meaning you have to add more chlorine to raise that up. So I hope this clears up some of the misconceptions about Trichlor tablets, and it educates you on the usage of Trichlor tablets and why overusing them is probably not the smartest way to maintain your pool, and using them as your primary sanitizer is also probably not the wisest thing to do. If you're looking for other podcasts that I recorded, you can go to my website, swimmingpoollearning.com, and on the banner, click on the podcast icon. That'll take you to a drop-down menu of other podcasts I recorded. If you want to enhance your business, definitely consider my coaching program at poolguycoaching.com. Thanks for listening to this podcast. Have a great rest of your week. God bless. Pool Service Pro. Open a Leslie's wholesale account today and receive wholesale pricing on products you use every day. Leslie's Pool Supply offers convenient locations that are open 7 days a week. Another great benefit of opening a Leslie's wholesale account is Leslie's referral program. Get referred to a customer looking for weekly pool service. Save time and money and grow your pool service route and become a Leslie's Pro.